The year was 1864, and the skies over South Carolina were thick with the smoke of a nation at war. While battles raged across distant fields, the small town of Willow Creek, tucked between sprawling plantations and dense pine forests, faced a different, more insidious kind of terror. Once a thriving settlement built on rice, indigo, and cotton, Willow Creek had been hollowed out by the war. Most of the town's men had marched off in gray uniforms, many never to return. Those left behind were mostly women, children, the elderly, and the enslaved, still waiting for freedom's uncertain dawn. Grand plantation houses now stood in decay, their paint curling beneath the relentless southern sun, as if even the buildings were surrendering to despair. At the edge of town stood one such crumbling mansion, home to the Caldwell family. Its master, Colonel James Caldwell, had fallen at Gettysburg the year before, leaving his widow, Eleanor, to fight a losing battle to maintain the estate with only their 16-year-old daughter, Abigail, and a few loyal servants clinging to the remnants of the old world. Abigail Caldwell was known throughout the county for her extraordinary artistic talent. Even as a child, she had demonstrated an uncanny ability to capture likenesses with nothing more than charcoal and paper. As she grew older, her portraits became so lifelike that locals swore they could see the gleam of moisture in the eyes she drew, the subtle rise and fall of a captured breath in a rendered chest. "She has a gift from God himself," the townspeople would whisper. But as the war dragged on and Willow Creek's fortunes waned, those whispers took on a different tone. It began with the disappearance of Thomas Jenkins, the elderly shopkeeper who had sat for Abigail on a warm April afternoon. His was to be the first in a series of portraits Abigail planned to create of Willow Creek's remaining residents, a testament to their endurance in these troubled times, she had said. 3 days after his sitting, Jenkins failed to open his general store. When concerned neighbors entered his modest home behind the shop, they found his bed unslept in, his supper from the previous evening untouched. The only thing out of place was a blank sheet of paper on his writing desk. Not truly blank upon closer inspection, but bearing the faintest outline of what might have been a face, as if a portrait had been erased, leaving only the ghost of an image behind. The disappearance might have been attributed to the chaos of wartime. Perhaps Jenkins had fled north or been captured by Union forces were it not for what happened next. Martha Bowford, the midwife who had delivered most of Willow Creek's children over the past 30 years, agreed to sit for Abigail 2 weeks after Jenkins vanished. Martha later told her sister she found it odd how intensely Abigail studied her during the session, how the girl's slender fingers moved across the paper with an almost fevered intensity, how her dark eyes seemed to gleam with an inner light that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. "She didn't just draw my face," Martha confided. "It was as if she was drawing something out of me." The next morning, Martha Bowfort was gone. Like Jenkins before her, she left behind a nearly blank sheet of paper with just the faintest suggestion of her weathered features visible if one held the page at just the right angle to the light. By the time Reverend William Hayes disappeared after his portrait session with Abigail, the people of Willow Creek could no longer deny that something sinister was occurring. 3 prominent citizens gone without a trace, each connected by a sitting with Abigail Caldwell, and an enigmatic, nearly empty page left behind. It was then that the rumors truly began to spread through the town like wildfire in drought-parched fields. "That girl is unnatural," declared Constance Pembroke, the postmaster's wife, after the Sunday service held in the absence of Reverend Hayes. "Always was, even as a child, never cried, never laughed like the others. Just watched and drew and watched. Her mother's side had strange blood," added Jeremiah Stone. The blacksmith whose forge had fallen silent as metal was diverted to the Confederate cause. "My grandfather told tales of Eleanor's grandmother, a woman who could speak to birds and predict storms before they formed. They say she knew the day of her death a year before it came." Such talk might have been dismissed as superstition in more prosperous times. But in 1864, with the world crumbling around them, the people of Willow Creek were primed to believe in darker forces. As more of their neighbors vanished after sitting for Abigail, 7 in total by the early days of August, fear calcified into certainty. Abigail Caldwell was bewitched, or perhaps a witch herself, stealing souls through her cursed portraits. A delegation of Willow Creek's remaining men approached the Caldwell house one evening as the summer sun cast long shadows across the overgrown gardens. They came armed not with torches and pitchforks as their ancestors might have, but with Bible verses on their lips and the weight of community judgment behind them. Abigail Caldwell met them on the veranda, her once proud posture now brittle with defensive anger. "My daughter is an artist, nothing more," she insisted, her voice carrying across the neglected lawn. "These disappearances are a tragedy, but to blame a child for them is unconscionable." "Mrs. Caldwell," said Elijah Cooper, who had assumed leadership of the town in the absence of so many others, "we do not come here lightly. 7 people are missing, and the only connection between them is your daughter's portraits. We must insist on speaking with Abigail." "She is indisposed," Abigail replied coldly, "and I will not have her subjected to an inquisition born of ignorance and fear. Good evening, gentlemen." As Eleanor turned to re-enter her home, Cooper called out, "The war has taken enough from Willow Creek. Mrs. Caldwell, we cannot stand by while something darker claims what remains. If you will not help us understand what is happening, we will be forced to take more decisive action." The threat hung in the air like the distant thunder of artillery fire. Abigail paused, her hand on the ornate doorknob of what had once been the finest home in the county. Without turning back, she replied, "My husband gave his life for a cause many of you championed. My daughter and I deserve better than to be threatened in our own home. But come back tomorrow at noon, and Abigail will answer your questions. Now, leave us to our evening's peace." As the men retreated down the winding path, Elijah Cooper glanced back at the upper windows of the Caldwell house. There, framed in the gathering dusk, stood a slender figure watching their departure. Even at a distance, he could feel the weight of Abigail Caldwell's gaze, cool and assessing, as if she were already committing his features to paper, already considering how to capture the essence of him in her terrible art. Cooper shuddered despite the evening heat. "God help us all," he murmured, "if we've waited too long to act." Inside the house, Eleanor climbed the curving staircase to her daughter's room, her heart heavy with dread. She found Abigail seated at her drawing table before the window, a fresh sheet of paper before her, her charcoals and pencils arranged with mathematical precision. "They're coming for you," Abigail said without preamble. "Tomorrow at noon. I cannot protect you any longer." Abigail turned her face serene in the lamplight. At 16, she possessed a beauty that was disconcerting in its perfection. Skin like porcelain, eyes the deep gray of storm clouds, lips that seemed perpetually on the verge of revealing some profound secret. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, practical for an artist who couldn't afford stray locks falling across her work. "You've never needed to protect me, Mother," she said, her voice soft but steady. "What happens through my art is beyond protection or prevention." Abigail crossed the room swiftly, kneeling beside her daughter's chair. "Then it's true. What they say, the disappearances are connected to my portraits," Abigail confirmed. "But not in the way they imagine. For God's sake, Abigail, explain it to me. 7 people are gone. The town is terrified." Abigail's gaze drifted to her drawing table where several completed portraits lay carefully stacked. On top was her most recent work, a striking likeness of Sarah Miller, the school teacher who had vanished 3 days prior. The portrait captured not just Sarah's features, but something ineffable about her spirit, the compassionate intelligence in her eyes, the determined set of her mouth that had helped her maintain discipline among her pupils even as the world around them descended into chaos. "I don't make them disappear, Mother," Abigail said, trailing one finger along the edge of Sarah's portrait. "I preserve them." Abigail stood abruptly, taking a step back from her daughter. "What are you saying? The war is coming closer every day. Union forces will reach Willow Creek soon enough. And even if they don't, what future remains here? Starvation, disease, the collapse of everything we've known." Abigail's voice remained calm, almost detached, as if discussing the weather rather than the fate of their community. "I offer an alternative. Why drawing them away into where, Abigail? Where have they gone?" Abigail gestured to her portraits. Into safety, into permanence. A small smile curved her lips. Into art. Ella Laner felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of her daughter's words became clear. That's not possible, she whispered. It cannot be, and yet it is. Abigail rose from her chair, moving to a large portfolio case leaning against the wall. She opened it carefully, extracting a larger piece of paper, not a portrait this time, but a landscape. As Ella Laner watched in growing horror, Abigail spread the drawing on her bed. It depicted a pastoral scene of remarkable detail and beauty. A sunlit meadow bordered by ancient oaks, a clear stream winding through tall grasses, wildflowers nodding in what seemed an almost perceptible breeze. And there, seated on the bank of the stream, were unmistakable figures. Thomas Jenkins, Martha Balfour, Reverend Hayes, and the 4 others who had disappeared from Willow Creek. They appeared peaceful, even happy. Jenkins was fishing, his face more relaxed than Ella Laner had ever seen it in life. Martha was gathering flowers while Reverend Hayes sat with an open Bible, apparently reading to the group. None showed any awareness of being observed, existing in their own perfect moment, frozen yet somehow alive. "What have you done?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "I've saved them," Abigail replied simply. "From war, from suffering, from the inevitable destruction coming to Willow Creek. They live now in a world of my creation, a better world than the one crumbling around us." This is ungodly," Ella Laner managed, though she couldn't tear her eyes from the scene, from the evident peace on the faces of the missing townspeople. "Is it?" Abigail challenged quietly. "Is it more ungodly than the thousands dying on battlefields for causes they barely understand? More ungodly than children starving because blockades prevent food from reaching them? More ungodly than the institution that built our fortune on the backs of people treated as less than human?" Ella Laner had no answer. The war had taken her husband, their fortune, and soon would likely take their home. The future stretched before them bleak and uncertain, and yet they had no choice. She finally said, "You took their lives without consent." "I offered them peace," Abigail countered. "Their bodies may have disappeared, but their essences live on in a world untouched by war or want." She carefully returned the landscape to its portfolio. "And tomorrow, when the men of Willow Creek come for me, I will offer them the same choice explicitly, since you find my previous method objectionable. They'll never agree. They'll call you a witch or worse." Abigail's smile was sad now. "Perhaps, but fear makes people consider options they would otherwise dismiss, and there is much to fear in Willow Creek these days." As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, Ella Laner realized with sudden clarity what her daughter intended. "You mean to draw the entire town into your papers?" "Not the entire town," Abigail corrected. "Only those who choose it, only those who look at what remains of their world and prefer the one I can create for them instead." She returned to her drawing table, selecting a fresh piece of paper. "The question, Mother, is whether you will be among them." Ella Laner Caldwell looked at her daughter, this child she had carried and raised, this stranger with power beyond understanding, and felt tears well in her eyes. "What happened to you, Abigail? When did you become this?" "I've always been this," Abigail replied, her pencil already moving across the paper in sure, swift strokes. "You simply never saw it until now." As Ella Laner left her daughter's room, closing the door softly behind her, she wondered how many others in Willow Creek would, when presented with the choice between a war-ravaged reality and Abigail's paper worlds, choose to disappear. She wondered, too, whether she would be strong enough to resist if Abigail turned those penetrating gray eyes upon her and began to draw. The night passed with excruciating slowness for Ella Laner. She sat in the parlor where she had once entertained the county's finest families, a single candle burning as she conserved the household's dwindling supply. The grand piano stood silent, its ivory keys untouched since news of James' death had reached them. The wallpaper, imported from France in happier times, was fading and peeling in places, much like the Confederacy itself, an extravagant dream disintegrating under the harsh light of reality. Occasionally, she heard movement from Abigail's room above, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of paper. Once she thought she heard voices, a murmured conversation between her daughter and someone else, but that was impossible. They were alone in the house, their last servants having departed weeks ago when Ella could no longer pay their wages. Toward dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her, and she dozed fitfully in her chair. She dreamed of James as she had last seen him, resplendent in his colonel's uniform, promising to return to them covered in glory. In the dream, as he turned to leave, his body began to flatten, to lose dimension, until he was nothing more than lines on paper that crumbled to dust in a harsh wind. She awoke with a start as sunlight streamed through the unwashed windows. For a moment, disoriented by her uncomfortable night, she couldn't recall why dread sat so heavily in her stomach. Then the events of the previous day rushed back. The delegation, the ultimatum, Abigail's confession. The grandfather clock showed 10:30. Less than 2 hours until the men of Willow Creek returned demanding answers she couldn't possibly give them. What could she say? That her daughter possessed some uncanny power to draw people into worlds of her creation. They would think her as mad as they already suspected Abigail to be. Ella rose stiffly, her joints protesting the night spent in the chair. She needed to speak with Abigail again to make one last attempt at understanding, perhaps even at dissuading her from whatever she planned for the town's delegation. But as she climbed the stairs and approached her daughter's door, an unfamiliar sound stopped her. Music, a piano being played with considerable skill, drifted from Abigail's room. Ella froze, her hand halfway to the doorknob. There was no piano in Abigail's room. The only one in the house was the grand piano downstairs, which had stood silent for over a year. The melody was Chopin, she realized, one of James's favorites, a nocturne he had often requested Ella play on evenings when the weight of the world seemed particularly heavy on his shoulders. But who could be playing? And how could the sound be coming from behind Abigail's closed door? Heart pounding, Eleanor pushed the door open. Abigail's room appeared much as it had the night before. The drawing table still stood by the window, papers and drawing implements arranged neatly upon it. The bed was made, its coverlet smooth. Abigail herself sat in a chair by the fireplace, watching her mother with that same serene expression she had worn during their conversation about the disappearances. But the music had stopped the moment Ella opened the door, and there was no piano to be seen. "Good morning, Mother," Abigail said calmly as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Did you sleep well?" Ella stepped into the room, her gaze darting to every corner, searching for anything that might explain what she had heard. "There was music," she said. "Chopin, coming from in here." "Yes," Abigail agreed simply. "Father always loved that piece." A chill ran through Ella that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Your father is dead, Abigail." "Is he?" Abigail rose from her chair and walked to her drawing table from beneath the stack of portraits. She withdrew another drawing and held it out to her mother. Eleanor took it with trembling hands. It was James, her James, captured with such precision that it seemed the paper might warm to the touch. He sat at a piano identical to the one downstairs, his fingers poised above the keys, his expression one of contentment she had rarely seen in his final years, as the burdens of plantation management and then war had weighed upon him. "This is cruel, Abigail," Eleanor whispered, unable to look away from her husband's face. "He's gone." "Not gone," Abigail corrected gently. "Preserved. As I told you last night, that's what my art does now. It doesn't just capture likenesses. It captures essences, souls if you prefer that term, and it gives them a home. I heard him playing." "You did." Abigail took the portrait back, her fingers caressing the image of her father with genuine affection. Sometimes, when the connection is particularly strong, as between a husband and wife, a father and daughter, the barrier between their world and ours thins. We can hear them, occasionally even see them, though they remain unaware of our observation. Ella sank onto the edge of Abigail's bed, her legs no longer able to support her. "When?" she asked. "When did you draw him in?" "The day after we received news of his death," Abigail replied, returning the portrait to its place on the table. "I couldn't bear the thought of him lying broken and alone on some distant battlefield. So I drew him as I remembered him in happier times, and I poured everything I felt for him into the portrait. Her voice softened. It was the first time it happened. The first time I created a refuge rather than simply an image. And the others, the townspeople? Practice? Abigail admitted. Each one taught me more about the process, about how to create worlds that would truly sustain them, not just empty facsimiles of life. She glanced at the clock on her mantle. The delegation will be here soon. I've been working through the night to prepare. Only then did Elelainer notice the new drawing spread across Abigail's drawing table. Not portraits this time, but scenes of Willow Creek itself. One showed the town square as it had been before the war, with shops bustling and women in fine dresses promenading along the sidewalks. Another depicted the church during Christmas services, candles glowing warmly against stained glass. A third illustrated a harvest festival with tables groaning under the weight of abundant food, and townsfolk dancing to fiddle music in the twilight. What are these for? Elelainer asked, though she feared she already knew. Options, Abigail said. Different sanctuaries for different preferences. Not everyone would choose the same ideal world after all. She gathered the drawings carefully. Some might prefer a Willow Creek that never knew war. Others might choose a world where their loved ones never left for battle or where they returned safely. I've tried to create varied possibilities. And if they refuse, if they reject your offer? Abigail's expression darkened slightly. Then they remain in this world with all its suffering and uncertainty. But they will leave me, leave us in peace. The distant sound of horses and wagon wheels on the gravel drive announced the arrival of the delegation. Eleanor moved to the window and saw Elijah Cooper leading a larger group than had come the previous evening. Nearly 20 men and several women, all with grim, determined expressions. There are more of them today, she observed, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. Of course, Abigail said, joining her at the window. Word has spread. The entire town knows about the disappearances now, and many have their own theories about my involvement. She smiled faintly. They're not entirely wrong. Abigail, Elelainer began turning to face her daughter, searching for words that might bridge the gulf that had opened between them. This power you have, it's extraordinary, perhaps even miraculous in its way. But to use it like this to make these decisions for others. I'm offering them a choice now, Abigail interrupted. As I'm offering you. She held out a drawing, another portrait, this one of Eleanor herself, looking younger, unburdened by grief, seated in the parlor of the Caldwell home, as it had been in its glory days. In the portrait, James stood behind Elalainer's chair, his hand resting affectionately on her shoulder. The scene radiated peace, security, love, everything that had been stripped from them by war and death. Join us, Mother, Abigail said softly. Father misses you, and I'll join you both once I've finished what needs to be done here. Eleanor stared at the portrait, at the life that could be hers again with a single word of acceptance. The temptation was almost overwhelming. To escape the collapsing world around them, to be reunited with James, to leave behind hunger and fear and grinding uncertainty. A sharp knock at the front door broke the spell. The delegation had reached the house and was demanding entrance. I must speak with them, Elelainer said, handing the portrait back to Abigail. Whatever happens next, they deserve to hear the truth. Abigail accepted the drawing, her expression unreadable. As you wish, but remember, Mother, the choice remains open to you, regardless of what transpires downstairs. Elelainer descended the staircase with as much dignity as she could muster, straightening her worn dress and patting her hair into place. Small gestures of propriety from a world that no longer existed. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused, took a deep breath, and opened the front door. Elijah Cooper stood at the threshold, flanked by the town's remaining business owners, farmers, and a few of their wives. Behind them, more of Willow Creek's residents waited in the overgrown garden, their faces taut with fear and suspicion. Mrs. Caldwell, Cooper began without preamble. We've come as agreed to speak with your daughter about the disappearances. Yes, Mr. Cooper, I remember our arrangement, Eleanor replied, her voice calmer than she felt. Please come into the parlor. Abigail will join us shortly." She led the delegation, or at least as many as could fit, into what had once been the Caldwell family's pride. Now the parlor's elegant furnishings were dusty, the curtains faded, the overall impression one of faded grandeur. Eleanor gestured for them to sit, though many chose to remain standing, too agitated for social niceties. "Before my daughter joins us," Eleanor said, addressing the room at large, "I feel I must prepare you for what you will hear. It will challenge everything you believe about the nature of our world." "We've heard enough superstitious nonsense already, Mrs. Caldwell," interrupted Harriet Cooper, Elijah's wife, and a woman known for her practical nature. "Some say your daughter is a witch. Others claim she's possessed. We're not here for more wild tales, but for the truth about our missing neighbors. The truth, Mrs. Cooper, is wilder than any tale you've yet heard," came Abigail's voice from the doorway. All heads turned as Abigail entered the parlor, a portfolio of drawings tucked under one arm. She had dressed with care in one of her better frocks, a blue muslin that had been altered several times as materials for new clothing became scarce. Her hair was neatly arranged, her bearing confident as she surveyed the assembled townsfolk. "Miss Caldwell," Elijah Cooper said, stepping forward, "7 of our citizens have vanished after sitting for portraits with you. We demand an explanation." "And you shall have one, Mr. Cooper," Abigail replied, moving to the center of the room, "though I doubt it will be the explanation you expect." Over the next quarter hour, as the grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the corner, Abigail explained to the increasingly astonished gathering what she had revealed to her mother the previous night. She spoke of her newfound ability to create worlds within her art, sanctuaries, she called them, and to draw living souls into these refuges of her creation. "The people you believe are missing are not gone," she concluded, opening her portfolio to reveal the landscape showing the first 7 subjects living peacefully in their pastoral setting. "They are simply elsewhere, safe from the ravages of war and want." A stunned silence followed her words. Then, predictably, disbelief and outrage erupted. "Witchcraft?" cried one of the farmers, making a warding sign that Eleanor recognized as far older than Christianity. "Madness," declared Harriet Cooper. "The girl has clearly lost her mind and now seeks to justify kidnapping or worse with fairy tales." "Where are they really?" demanded Thomas Miller, the husband of the missing school teacher. "What have you done with Sarah and the others?" Abigail remained composed in the face of their reaction. "I understand your skepticism. What I described defies conventional understanding, but consider the evidence. 7 people vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle. No bodies found despite extensive searching, and each disappeared after I captured their likeness on paper." "That proves nothing except your involvement," Elijah Cooper said, though Eleanor noticed his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Perhaps this will be more convincing," Abigail suggested. She withdrew another drawing from her portfolio, this one showing Sarah Miller, the school teacher, seated at a desk in what appeared to be Willow Creek Schoolhouse, though one far better equipped than the actual building had ever been. She held the portrait toward Thomas Miller. "Your wife, sir. In the schoolhouse she always dreamed of having for her pupils." Miller took the drawing with reluctant hands. As he stared at the image of his wife, his expression shifted from skepticism to wonder. "This desk," he whispered. "Sarah described it to me once. Said her teacher in Charleston had a desk like this with cubby holes for different papers and a surface that could be adjusted for standing or sitting." He looked up at Abigail, confusion evident in his eyes. "She never told anyone else about that desk." "How could you know?" "Because Sarah is there now," Abigail said gently. "In a world where her ideal schoolhouse exists, where children come eager to learn, where knowledge isn't interrupted by war or hardship." Others crowded around to see the drawing. Murmurs of amazement mingled with continuing expressions of disbelief and fear. "It's just a drawing," Harriet Cooper insisted, though she eyed the portrait with evident unease. "Detailed, yes, but nothing supernatural." "Is it merely a drawing?" Abigail challenged. She turned to Martha Beaufort's sister, Agnes, who stood near the back of the group. Miss Bowford, when your sister disappeared, did you not find a nearly blank sheet of paper where she had been sitting? Agnes Bowfort nodded reluctantly. I did. Just the faintest outline, like a drawing that had been erased. And did you keep that paper? I? Yes. Agnes reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded sheet. I couldn't bring myself to discard it, thinking it might be some clue. May I? Abigail held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Agnes surrendered the paper. Abigail placed the seemingly blank sheet on a small table where all could see it. Then from her pocket, she produced a piece of charcoal and held it poised above the paper. Watch carefully, she instructed the gathering. With swift, sure strokes, Abigail began to draw on the paper. But rather than creating an image from nothing, her charcoal seemed to be revealing what was already there, bringing forth the details of a face, Martha Beaufort's face, as if it had been there all along, invisible until Abigail's touch made it manifest. Gasps filled the room as the portrait took shape, showing Martha not as the tired, careworn midwife they had known, but as a younger woman, her eyes bright with purpose, her hands extended as if welcoming a newborn into the world. This is what remains when someone enters my drawings, Abigail explained as she completed the portrait. A sort of negative space waiting to be filled again with their essence should they choose to return. But none have chosen to return thus far. They prefer the worlds I've created for them. This cannot be real, Elijah Cooper said, but his voice had lost all conviction. He was staring at Martha's portrait with undisguised awe. It is real, Mr. Cooper, Abigail insisted. And now I offer the same choice to all of you. She gestured to her portfolio where the drawings of various versions of Willow Creek waited. Our town is dying. The war approaches. Even if the Confederacy somehow prevails, nothing will ever be as it was before. I can offer you sanctuaries. Worlds where Willow Creek remains as you remember it in its best days, or as you wish it could be. Her words hung in the air, met with conflicting expressions of longing, fear, and disbelief. Ella Laner watched the townsfolk, these people she had known all her life, as they struggled to comprehend what Abigail was offering. Escape, preservation, a kind of immortality within art. And if we refuse, asked Jeremiah Stone, the blacksmith, his voice gruff with suspicion despite the evidence of his own eyes. Then you continue in this world with all its hardships and uncertainties, Abigail answered. I force no one. The choice must be freely made. How do we know these paper worlds are real? Harriet Cooper demanded. How do we know our neighbors aren't simply trapped in some hellish prison of your making? Abigail considered this, then nodded as if coming to a decision. A fair question, Mrs. Cooper. I can offer you something close to proof, though it requires a certain openness to possibilities beyond conventional understanding. She returned to her portfolio and withdrew yet another drawing. This one of Reverend Hayes shone in his pulpit, but with a backdrop far grander than Willow Creek's modest church had ever possessed. Reverend Hayes was the third to disappear, Abigail said, placing the portrait on the table beside Martha's. He entered a world where his ministry flourishes, where his congregation grows daily, where his sermons inspire genuine transformations of faith. She placed her fingertips lightly on the drawing. Sometimes, as I told my mother earlier, the barrier between their world and ours can become thin, particularly when strong emotion or connection is involved. The room had grown utterly silent, every eye fixed on Abigail and the portrait beneath her fingers. Even the clock seemed to have stilled its ticking, as if time itself waited to see what would happen next. Reverend Hayes, Abigail said softly, her voice taking on a resonant quality it had lacked before. Your flock seeks reassurance. They fear for your welfare. Would you speak to them through me and ease their minds? For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then slowly, impossibly, the portrait began to change. The lines seemed to deepen, the shading to intensify until the image of Hayes appeared almost three-dimensional despite remaining confined to the paper. And then, most astonishing of all, a voice filled the room. Not Abigail's voice, but the unmistakable resonant baritone of Reverend William Hayes. Be not afraid, the voice said, seeming to emanate from the portrait itself. For I dwell in the house of the Lord in a mansion prepared by the hand of his servant Abigail. Here there is no war, no hunger, no despair, only the pure joy of communion with the divine and with one another. Women fainted, men staggered back as if physically struck. Eleanor herself felt lightheaded, though she had been at least partially prepared by her earlier experience with James's piano playing. The voice continued, growing stronger. I preach to souls untainted by the sorrows of your world. I break bread with Thomas Jenkins and Martha Beaufort and the others who have come before you. We lack for nothing here, and there is room for all who would join us. As suddenly as it had begun, the voice ceased. The portrait returned to its original state, detailed and lifelike, but unquestionably just ink on paper. In the profound silence that followed, Abigail looked around at the shaken gathering. Now you have heard one who has crossed over. Will you join them? Will you allow me to preserve you? To draw you into worlds free from the suffering that surrounds us? The response was not immediate. Some of the townsfolk had backed away, pressing themselves against the walls of the parlor, as if distance might protect them from whatever power had just manifested. Others moved closer, drawn by fascination or longing, or both. Thomas Miller was the first to step forward, his eyes never leaving the portrait of his wife that he still held. I want to be with Sarah, he said simply. Whatever this is, miracle or witchcraft, I don't care. I want to be where she is. And so you shall, Abigail promised. She gestured to a chair by the window. Sit there, Mr. Miller, and I will draw you into your wife's world. As Miller moved to take his place, others began to speak up as well. My son died at Shiloh, said Margaret Winters, an elderly woman who had lost her last living relative to the war. Could he be in one of your worlds? I can create a world where he awaits you, Abigail offered. Not the real Daniel, perhaps, but an essence so true to him that neither you nor he would know the difference. Then I, too, will sit for you, Mrs. Winters decided, her rheumy eyes suddenly clear with purpose. One by one, nearly half of the assembled townsfolk declared their intention to enter Abigail's paper worlds. Some sought reunion with lost loved ones. Others simply wished to escape the grinding hardship that had become their daily reality. A few, like Agnes Beaufort, were drawn by curiosity as much as desperation, a chance to experience something beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. Not all were convinced, however. Elijah Cooper and his wife remained steadfastly opposed, as did several others who eyed Abigail with a mixture of fear and moral outrage. This is an abomination, Cooper declared, finding his voice at last. A perversion of God's natural order. Those who choose this path condemn their immortal souls to do. I know not what. Perhaps, Abigail acknowledged. Or perhaps they simply choose a different form of existence, one no less valid than what we call reality. She turned to those who had expressed a desire to enter her drawings. I cannot take you all at once. The process requires focus and energy. I will begin with Mr. Miller, then work through the rest of you over the coming days. And those of us who refuse, Harriet Cooper demanded. What becomes of us? You continue on as before, Abigail said. Fighting, surviving, hoping, whatever sustains you in this world. I wish you no ill, Mrs. Cooper. This is simply a choice, not a mandate. Ella Lehner, who had remained silent throughout the extraordinary proceedings, finally spoke. Those who wish to remain in our conventional reality are welcome to leave now. Those who have chosen Abigail's alternative may stay. The room divided itself along these lines, with Cooper leading the skeptics and terrified back outside, while Thomas Miller and approximately a dozen others remained, their faces alight with a mixture of fear and anticipation. As the door closed behind the departing group, Abigail turned to her mother. You still haven't told me your decision. Ella Lehner looked at her daughter, this child who had somehow transcended the boundaries of normal human capability, who offered escape to a dying town even as she herself remained bound to the task of creating these refuges for others. I'll stay with you, Eleanor said quietly. For now, someone must bear witness to what happens here, must help you manage the transitions. When you've completed your work, then we can discuss my own path. Abigail nodded, accepting this provisional decision. She turned to Thomas Miller, who sat waiting in the chair by the window, clutching his wife's portrait like a talisman. "Are you ready, Mr. Miller?" she asked, selecting a fresh sheet of paper and arranging her drawing implements on a small table beside his chair. "I am," he replied, his voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of what he was agreeing to. "Will it hurt?" "No," Abigail assured him. "You'll feel a sort of drawing sensation, as if something is pulling at your essence rather than your body. Then a moment of disorientation, and then you'll be with Sarah in the world I've created for her." Miller nodded, settling back in the chair. "Then begin, Miss Caldwell. I've been separated from my wife long enough." Abigail positioned herself before him, her charcoal poised above the paper. "Look at me, Mr. Miller," she instructed. "Think of Sarah. Picture her as clearly as you can in your mind." As Miller complied, Abigail began to draw. Her hand moved with that same fevered intensity Eleanor had observed the previous evening, capturing not just Miller's features, but something deeper. The longing in his eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of years of hard work and harder losses, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his mingled fear and hope. The others watched in fascinated silence as the portrait took shape with remarkable speed. In less than 10 minutes, Abigail had created a likeness so accurate that it seemed Miller's reflection had somehow been transferred directly to the paper. But she didn't stop there. As her subject watched with widening eyes, Abigail began to add elements around his figure. The suggestion of a schoolhouse interior, a desk that matched the one in Sarah's portrait, a window through which sunlight streamed. "I can feel it," Miller whispered, his voice distant, dreamlike. "I can feel myself stretching somehow, being pulled toward the paper." "Don't resist," Abigail advised, her own voice taut with concentration. "Let yourself follow the connection I'm creating." The others in the room gasped as Miller's form seemed to blur slightly, as if seen through heat waves rising from summer-baked earth. His outline remained seated in the chair, but his substance, something indefinable yet undeniably essential, appeared to be flowing toward the portrait in Abigail's hands. "Sarah," Miller breathed, reaching out one increasingly transparent hand. "I can see her now. She's waiting for me." With those words, Thomas Miller, or what remained of him in the conventional world, vanished entirely. In the chair where he had sat, a single sheet of paper drifted to the floor, bearing just the faintest suggestion of a human form. On Abigail's drawing, however, the image had transformed. It now showed both Thomas and Sarah Miller reunited in the idealized schoolhouse, their expressions conveying a joy so profound it was almost painful to behold. A collective exhalation filled the room as the remaining volunteers comprehended what they had just witnessed. Far from deterring them, the sight of Miller's transition seemed to strengthen their resolve. Several stepped forward, eager to be next. "Patience," Abigail cautioned, setting aside the completed portrait with evident fatigue. "Each drawing takes something from me as well. I must rest before attempting another." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Abigail drew 3 more of Willow Creek's residents into her paper worlds. Mrs. Winters, who joined a version of her son, created from her memories and Abigail's art. Jeremiah Stone's widowed daughter, who entered a world where her husband had never marched away to war, and Agnes Beaufort, who chose to join her sister Martha in the pastoral landscape Abigail had first revealed. Each transition followed the same pattern. Abigail would draw the subject with extraordinary precision, then add elements of the world they wished to enter. The subject would begin to blur, to speak of seeing their destination, and then vanish, leaving behind only the faintest outline on a sheet of paper that drifted to the floor, while their completed portrait showed them integrated into their chosen sanctuary, BY Sunset. Abigail was visibly exhausted, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her charcoal after the 4th transition. "No more today," Ella Laner insisted, bringing her daughter a glass of water. "You've done enough." The remaining volunteers, understanding the toll the process was taking, agreed to return the following day. As they left, their faces showed none of the fear that had marked the delegation's arrival that morning, only anticipation. an almost serene acceptance of the extraordinary path they had chosen. When the house was empty, save for mother and daughter, Ella helped Abigail to her room where the girl collapsed onto her bed, too drained even to remove her dress. "It gets easier," Abigail murmured as Ella removed her shoes and covered her with a light blanket. "The first few were the hardest when I was still learning. Now I know how to create the connections, how to guide them through, but multiple transitions in one day. That's still difficult. Rest now," Ella soothed, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As Abigail drifted towards sleep, she reached out and caught her mother's hand. "You saw them cross over. You saw where they went. Do you still doubt the mercy of what I offer?" Ella considered the question carefully. She had indeed witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied rational explanation, yet could not be denied. She had seen the joy on Thomas Miller's face as he perceived his wife waiting for him. She had heard the peace in Margaret Winter's voice as she described catching sight of her long-dead son. "I don't doubt that you believe you're offering mercy," she finally answered. "And perhaps you are. But altering the natural order so profoundly, there may be consequences we cannot foresee." Abigail's eyes were already closing, fatigue overcoming her desire to continue the philosophical debate. "There are always consequences," she murmured. "The question is whether they're worse than the alternative." As her daughter slipped into sleep, Ella remained seated on the edge of the bed, troubled by thoughts she could scarcely articulate. What Abigail was doing violated everything Ella had been raised to believe about life, death, and the proper boundaries between the two. Yet she could not deny the evidence of her own senses, nor the fact that those who had chosen to enter Abigail's drawings had done so willingly, even eagerly. Was it so different really from the promises of heaven that Reverend Hayes had preached each Sunday? A different form of afterlife perhaps, but one that offered the same essential comfort, that consciousness, identity, the self, whatever one chose to call it, could persist beyond the dissolution of the physical body. The difference, of course, was that heaven required death as its threshold. Abigail's paper worlds did not. They required only surrender to her art, her vision, her extraordinary power to capture and transform reality itself. As night deepened around the Caldwell house, Ella found herself wondering what James would say if he knew what their daughter had become. Would he be horrified at this subversion of nature's laws? Or would he, like Thomas Miller, choose reunion over conventional existence, and what of her own choice? Abigail had offered her a place in a world where James waited, where the Caldwell family could be whole again, in a sanctuary untouched by war or want. The temptation remained powerful, pulsing beneath her thoughts like a second heartbeat. But someone needed to remain to bear witness, to help Abigail through the taxing process of creating these refuges for others, to serve as an anchor to the conventional world, even as its inhabitants increasingly chose to abandon it. For now, at least, Ella would remain that anchor. She would watch over her daughter, this extraordinary, terrifying, miraculous child who had somehow transcended the boundaries of art to become something akin to a creator herself. Tomorrow would bring more transitions, more choices, more blurring of the line between what was real and what was drawn. And eventually, Ella knew she too would have to decide which side of that line she wished to inhabit. But for tonight, in this quiet moment beside her sleeping daughter, it was enough simply to acknowledge the wonder and the dread that walked hand in hand through the halls of what remained of their life together. The following days took on a rhythm that, despite the extraordinary nature of the events, began to feel almost routine. Each morning, volunteers would arrive at the Caldwell house, their faces set with determination or anticipation, or both. Abigail would draw them one by one into their chosen sanctuaries, some joining loved ones already there, others entering new worlds created specifically for them. By the end of the week, 23 of Willow Creek's remaining residents had crossed over into Abigail's paper worlds. Each transition left behind a nearly blank sheet bearing just the ghost of an image, while the completed portraits, carefully stored in Abigail's growing collection, showed the subjects integrated into their new realities. Not everyone chose to go. Elijah and Harriet Cooper remained steadfastly opposed, gathering around them a group of like-minded townsfolk who viewed Abigail's power with suspicion or outright hostility. They kept their distance from the Caldwell house, though occasionally Eleanor would see them watching from across the street, their expressions a mixture of fear and grim fascination. "They think I'm stealing souls," Abigail remarked one evening as she noticed Cooper and several others observing the day's volunteers departing. "As if souls were possessions that could be taken rather than essences that can choose their own path." "They're afraid," Elena replied, drawing the curtains against the watchers. "Fear has always been the response to that which cannot be easily understood." "And you, mother?" Abigail asked, turning from the window to study her parents' face. "Are you still afraid?" Elena considered the question. The initial shock and horror she had felt upon learning of Abigail's ability had gradually given way to a kind of wondering acceptance. She had witnessed too many transitions now, seen too many expressions of joy as the volunteers perceived their destinations to maintain her original conviction that what Abigail was doing was fundamentally wrong. "Not afraid," she finally answered, "but still unsettled. The natural order of things." "The natural order brought us war?" Abigail interrupted, a rare flash of impatience crossing her features. "It brought us suffering and separation and death. Perhaps what I offer is more natural than what we've been conditioned to accept." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knocking at the front door interrupted their conversation. Visitors at this hour were unusual. The day's scheduled transitions had been completed hours ago, and it was nearly dusk. Eleanor went to answer the door, Abigail following close behind. On the porch stood Harriet Cooper alone and visibly distraught. "Mrs. Cooper," Eleanor greeted her, surprised. "This is unexpected. May I come in?" Harriet asked, her voice strained. "I need to speak with your daughter." Curious, Eleanor stepped aside to admit the woman who had been among Abigail's most vocal critics. Harriet entered the house, her posture rigid with what Eleanor recognized as tightly controlled panic. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Cooper?" Abigail asked once they had settled in the parlor, her tone polite but cautious. Harriet took a deep breath as if steeling herself. "It's Elijah," she said. "He's fallen ill, very ill. The doctor says it's typhoid fever. He doesn't expect my husband to survive the night." "I'm very sorry to hear that," Abigail said, genuine sympathy in her voice despite the Coopers' previous antagonism. "But I'm not sure how I can help. Don't you?" Harriet's laugh was brittle, edged with desperation. "You've been helping others escape this wretched reality for days now. I've seen them enter this house troubled and leave it transformed. Even before they cross over, as you call it, they have hope again. Purpose. You've come to request a portrait for your husband," Abigail realized, "after speaking so forcefully against what I do." "Desperate times breed desperate measures, Miss Caldwell," Harriet replied, a flush of shame coloring her cheeks. "Elijah is dying. Whatever objections we had to your methods seem less important now than the possibility of saving him from suffering." Eleanor watched her daughter carefully, curious how she would respond to this request from someone who had denounced her as unnatural, possibly even demonic. Abigail's expression remained thoughtful, betraying neither satisfaction at the reversal nor resentment of the previous accusations. "Does your husband share your change of heart, Mrs. Cooper?" she finally asked. "The transition works best when the subject is willing." "He sent me here," Harriet admitted. "His fever broke briefly this afternoon, and he told me to come to you to ask if you would draw him into somewhere better, somewhere without pain." Her composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her face. "He's suffered so much, Miss Caldwell. The war took our son 2 years ago. Our business is failing, and now this illness. It's as if everything we valued is being stripped away, piece by piece." Abigail rose from her chair. "I'll need to go to him," she said, already moving to gather her drawing materials. "The portraits must be created in the presence of the subject, especially when they're weakened by illness." Relief washed over Harriet's face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever it is you do, miracle or magic or something else entirely. Thank you for offering it even to those who doubted you." "Doubt is natural, Mrs. Cooper," Abigail replied as she packed charcoals and papers into a leather satchel. Its fear transformed into action that becomes problematic. Within minutes, the three women were making their way through Willow Creek's darkening streets toward the Cooper home. The town felt eerily empty now, Eleanor realized, with so many residents either lost to the war or transferred to Abigail's paper worlds. Many houses stood vacant, their windows dark, their gardens overgrown. Elijah Cooper lay in the bedroom of the modest home he shared with Harriet. His robust frame wasted by fever, his breathing labored. The room smelled of sickness and medicinal herbs. The doctor had clearly tried traditional remedies before pronouncing the case hopeless. "Elijah," Harriet said softly, approaching the bed, "I've brought Abigail Caldwell as you asked." Cooper's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly through the haze of fever. "Miss Caldwell," he rasped. "You came." "Of course," Abigail replied, setting down her satchel and beginning to arrange her materials. "Despite our differences, I wouldn't refuse such a request." "Didn't understand before," Cooper managed, each word clearly costing him effort. "Thought it was wrong, unnatural. But dying's unnatural, too, isn't it? Body fighting itself. World designed all wrong. Save your strength, Mr. Cooper," Abigail advised, selecting a sheet of paper and positioning herself where she could clearly see his face. "I need you to focus on what you want, where you want to go, who you want to be with." Cooper's feverish gaze fixed on his wife. "Harriet," he said, "and Michael, our boy." "Your son," Abigail nodded. "I can create a world where he waits for you, Mr. Cooper. A world without war or illness or loss. Is that what you wish?" "Yes," Cooper whispered, tears tracking down his hollow cheeks. "Please, please." Harriet moved to stand behind Abigail, watching with mingled hope and trepidation as the girl began to draw. Unlike the previous transitions Eleanor had witnessed, this one had a quality of urgency about it. Abigail's hand moved even more swiftly than usual, as if racing against the fever's progress. The portrait took shape with remarkable speed. Elijah Cooper, not as he was now, ravaged by illness, but as he had been in his prime, strong, confident, his eyes clear and purposeful. Around him, Abigail sketched elements of what Eleanor presumed was the Cooper home as it had once been before war and hardship had taken their toll. And there, emerging from the lines of Abigail's charcoal, was a young man with Cooper's jawline and Harriet's eyes. Michael, the son lost to battle 2 years earlier. "I see him," Cooper breathed, his gaze fixed, not on the drawing, but on some middle distance, as if perceiving directly what Abigail was creating on paper. "Michael, he's waiting. He looks just as he did before he left." Harriet stifled a sob, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Tell him I love him," she whispered. "Tell him I'll join you both soon." As with the previous transitions, Cooper's form began to blur, to lose definition around the edges. But there was a difference this time, an urgency, a sense that two processes were racing toward the same end. Abigail's art pulling Cooper toward her paper world and death reaching for him from the opposite direction. "Hurry," Eleanor found herself urging her daughter, understanding instinctively that if death claimed Cooper before the transition was complete, he would be beyond even Abigail's extraordinary reach. Abigail needed no prompting. Her hand flew across the paper, adding final details, strengthening the connection between the dying man and his refuge. "Come now, Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice taking on that resonant quality Eleanor had heard when she summoned Reverend Hayes's voice from his portrait. "Your son is waiting. Your pain is ending. Cross over now." With a sound somewhere between a sigh and a word, perhaps Michael or Harriet, or simply an exhalation of relief, Elijah Cooper vanished from his deathbed. As with the others, a nearly blank sheet of paper drifted onto the bedding where his body had lain, bearing just the faintest suggestion of a human form. In Abigail's hands, the completed portrait showed Elijah and Michael Cooper embracing, their faces alight with the joy of reunion. The background, a sunlit version of the family home as it must have appeared in happier times. Harriet approached slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the drawing. "May I hold it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Abigail nodded, carefully transferring the portrait to Harriet's outstretched hands. "They're waiting for you," she said gently. "Whenever you're ready to join them." Harriet stared at the image of her husband and son, her expression cycling through grief, wonder, and something approaching peace. "Not yet," she finally said. "I have arrangements to make first, people to speak with." She looked up at Abigail. "Will you draw me when I'm ready?" "Of course," Abigail promised. "The world I've created for them will remain accessible to you whenever you choose to cross over." As they left the Cooper home, Harriet clutching the portrait to her chest as if it were the most precious object in the world, Ella Lehner was struck by how drastically the situation had changed in just a few days. Those who had been most opposed to Abigail's power were now embracing it as their last best hope in a world coming apart at the seams. "It will be like this now," Abigail said quietly as they walked back through the darkening town. "More will come as word spreads of Elijah's transition. The desperate, the dying, the bereaved. They'll all seek what I can offer." "And you'll help them all?" Eleanor asked, studying her daughter's profile in the fading light. "As many as I can," Abigail confirmed, "until there's no one left who wishes to cross over." And then, Abigail turned to look at her mother, her gray eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. "And then, Mother, it will be our turn. Father is waiting. A world without war or loss or separation awaits us." Ella Lehner didn't respond immediately. The prospect of reunion with James remained powerfully tempting. Yet something in her still hesitated at the threshold of such an irrevocable choice. "We have time yet," she finally said. "There are still many in Willow Creek who will need your help before we consider our own crossing." Abigail nodded, accepting this continued deferral with the same patience she had shown throughout. "As you wish, Mother. But remember, the offer remains open always." As they passed the church steeple, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue of the evening sky, Ella Lehner wondered what Reverend Hayes would say about the exodus Abigail had initiated. Would he see it as a form of salvation, a mercy in these desperate times? Or would he, despite his own transition into one of Abigail's paper worlds, recognize it as a fundamental disruption of the divine plan? Perhaps both perspectives were valid, Eleanor reflected. Perhaps what Abigail offered was both miracle and transgression, both mercy and hubris, a human hand reaching into the territory of the divine, rearranging the pieces of reality itself. Whatever theological interpretation one might apply, the practical reality was undeniable. Willow Creek was emptying, its residents choosing Abigail's paper sanctuaries over the hardships of their war-ravaged existence. Soon, Eleanor suspected the town would stand entirely vacant, a ghost settlement populated only by memories and the faint outlines left behind on sheets of paper, marking where people had once been before they chose to become art. The days that followed proved Eleanor's prediction accurate. As news of Elijah Cooper's transition spread through what remained of Willow Creek, more residents came to the Caldwell house seeking Abigail's assistance. Some were ill, like Cooper. Others were simply weary of struggle, of deprivation, of the constant uncertainty that had become their daily reality. Abigail drew them all. The elderly who had outlived children and grandchildren. Young mothers whose husbands would never return from distant battlefields. Children orphaned by war or disease. For each she created a tailored sanctuary, a paper world that addressed their deepest longings. Family reunions, restored health, prosperity, peace. All were possible within the boundaries of Abigail's art. Harriet Cooper returned a week after her husband's transition, having settled her affairs and distributed her remaining possessions among those few who had chosen to remain in the conventional world. Abigail drew her into the same portrait that already contained Elijah and Michael. The family reunited in perpetuity within the confines of a single sheet of paper. By mid-September, Willow Creek had become a town of empty buildings and overgrown gardens. Fewer than a dozen residents remained, most of them too skeptical of Abigail's power to consider the alternative she offered, regardless of how bleak.